Hello, everyone, and welcome to White Fang Wednesday, where I'll be reading White Fang in just a few moments. For right now, I'm going to let people know that I'm streaming, and I'll be right back. Alright, everyone, welcome back from that first advertisement. Your commercial break. Let's go ahead and get into the book. Hands of the Man Animals. He came to modify the law that he was. One moment. Sorry, I take that ad starts off for something else. Hands of the Man Animals. He came to modify the law that he had learned from Grey Beaver, namely that the unpardonable crime was to bite one of the gods in this village. After the custom of all dogs in all villages, White Fang went foraging for food. A boy was chopping frozen moose meat with an axe, and the chips were flying in the snow. White Fang, sliding by in quest of meat, stopped and began to eat the chips. He observed the boy lay down the axe and take up a stout club. White Fang sprang clear, just in time to escape a descending blow. The boy pursued him, and he, a stranger in the village, fled between two teepees to find himself cornered against a high earth bank. There was no escape for White Fang. The only way out was between two teepees, and this the boy guarded, holding his club prepared to strike. He drew in on his cornered quarry. White Fang was furious. He faced the boy, bristling and snarling, his sense of justice outraged. He knew the law of forage. All the wastage of meat, such as the frozen chips, belonged to the dog that found it. He had done no wrong, broken no law. Yet here was this boy, preparing to give him a beating. White Fang scarcely knew what happened. He did it in a surge of rage, and he did it so quickly that the boy did not know either. All the boy knew was that he had in some unaccountable way been overturned to the snow, and that his club hand had been ripped wide open by White Fang's teeth. But White Fang knew that he had broken the law of the gods. He had driven his teeth into the sacred flesh of one of them, and he could expect nothing but a most terrible punishment. He fled away to Grey Beaver, behind those whose protecting legs he crouched, when the bitten boy and the boy's family came demanding vengeance, but they went away with vengeance unsatisfied. Grey Beaver defended White Fang. So did Mitsa and Clucooch. White Fang, listening to the wordy war and watching the angry gestures, knew that his act was justified. And so it came that he learned there were gods and gods. There were his gods, and there were other gods, and between them there was a difference. Justice or injustice, it was all the same. He must take all things from the hands of his own gods, but he was not compelled to take injustice from the other gods. It was his privilege to resent it with his teeth, and this also was a law of the gods. Before the day was out, White Fang was to learn more about this law. Mitsa, alone, gathering firewood in the forest, encountered the boy that had been bitten. With him were other boys. Hot words passed, then all the boys attacked. Mitsa, it was going hard with him. Blows were raining upon him from all sides. White Fang looked on at first. This was an affair of the gods, and no concern of his. Then he realized that this was Mitsa, one of his own particular gods. who was being maltreated. It was no it was it was no reasoned impulse that made White Fang do what he did. A mad rush of anger sent him leaping in amongst the combatants. 5 minutes later, the landscape was covered with fleeing boys, many of whom dripping blood under the snow in token that White Fang's teeth had not been idle. When Mitsa told his story in camp, Grey Beaver ordered meat to be given to White Fang. He ordered much meat to be given, and White Fang, gorged and sleepy by the fire, knew that the law had received its verification. It was in line with these experiences that White Fang came to learn the law of property and the duty of the defense of property. From the protection of his god's body of the protection to the protection of his god's possessions was a step. And this step he made, what was his god's was to be defended against all the world, even to the extent of biting other gods. Not only was such an act sacrilegious in its nature, but it was fraught with peril. The gods were all powerful, and a dog was no match against them. Yet White Fang learned to face them, fiercely belligerent and unafraid. Duty rose above fear, and thieving gods learned to leave Grey Beaver's property alone. One thing in this connection White Fang quickly learned, and that was that a thieving god was usually a cowardly god, and prone to run away at the sound of the alarm. Also, he learned that but brief time elapsed between his soundings of the alarm and Grey Beaver coming to his aid. He came to know that it was not fear of him that drove the thief away, but fear of Grey Beaver. White Fang did not give the alarm by barking. He never barked. His method was to drive straight at the intruder, and to sink his teeth in if he could. Because he was morose and solitary, having nothing to do with the other dogs, he was unusually fitted to guard his master's property, and in this he was encouraged and trained by Grey Beaver. One result of this was to make White Fang more ferocious and indomitable, and more solitary. The months went by, binding stronger and stronger the covenant between dog and man. This was the ancient covenant that the first wolf that came in from the wild entered into with man. And like all succeeding wolves and wild dogs that had done likewise, White Fang worked the covenant out for himself. The terms were simple. For the possession of a flesh and blood god, he exchanged his own liberty. Food and fire, protection and companionship were some of the things he had received from the god. In return, he guarded the god's property, defended his body, worked for him, and obeyed him. The possession of a god implies service. White Fang's was a service of duty and awe, but not of love. He did not know what love was. He had no experience of love. Quiche was a remote memory. Besides, not only had he abandoned the wild and his kind when he gave himself up to man, but the terms of the covenant were such that if he ever met Quiche again, he would not desert his god to go with her. His allegiance to man seemed somehow a law of his being greater than the love of liberty, of kind and kin. Chapter break. Again, I make sure that I can read and my throat isn't messed up for it by taking a quick break, having some water, and continuing afterwards. There we go. Chapter 6 Famine. The spring of the year was at hand when Grey Beaver finished his long journey. It was April, and White Fang was a year old when he pulled into the home village and was loosed from the harness of Mitzah. Through a long way, though a long way from his full growth, White Fang, next to Lip Lip, was the largest yearling in the village, both from his father, the wolf, and from Quiche. He had inherited stature, and strength. And already he was measuring up alongside the full-grown dogs, but he had not yet grown compact. His body was slender and rangy, and his strength more stringy than massive. His coat was the true wolf grey, and to all appearances he was true wolf himself. The quarter strain of dog he had inherited from Quiche had left no mark on him, physically, though it played its part in his mental makeup. He wandered through the village, recognizing with strayed satisfaction the various gods he had known. Before the long journey, then there were the dogs. Puppies growing up like himself, and grown dogs that did not look so large and formidable as the memory pictures he retained of them. Also, he stood less in fear of them than formerly, stalking among them with a certain careless ease that was as new to him as it was enjoyable. There was Basik, a grizzled old fellow that in his younger days had but to uncover his fangs to send White Fang cringing and crouching. To the right about from him, White Fang had learned much of his own insignificance, and from him he was to learn much of the change and development that had taken place in himself, while Basik had been growing weaker with age. White Fang had been growing stronger with youth. It was at the cutting up of a moose, fresh killed, that White Fang learned of the changing relations in which he stood to the dog world. He had got for himself a hoof and part of the shin bone, to which quite a bit of meat was attached, withdrawn from the immediate scramble of the other dogs, in fact, out of sight behind a thicket. He was devouring his prize, when Basik rushed in upon him. Before he knew what he was doing, he had slashed the intruder twice, and sprung clear. Basik was surprised by the other temerity and swiftness of attack. He stood gazing stupidly across at White Fang, the raw red shin bone between them. Basik was old, and already he had come to know the increasing valor of the dogs. It had been his wont to bully. Bitter experiences these which perforce he swallowed, calling up upon all his wisdom. To cope with them in the old days, he would have sprung upon White Fang in a fury of righteous wrath. But now his waning powers would not permit such a course. He bristled fiercely and looked ominously across the shin bone at White Fang, and White Fang, resurrecting quite a deal of the old awe, seemed to wilt and to shrink in upon himself, and to grow small. But he cast about in his mind for a way to beat a retreat, not too inglorious, and right here, Basik Ed. Had he contented himself with looking fierce and ominous, all would have been well. White Fang, on the verge of retreat, would have retreated, leaving the meat to him. But Basik did not wait. He considered the victory already his, and stepped forward to the meat. As he bent his head carelessly to smell it, White Fang bristled slightly. Even then, it was not too late for Basik to retrieve the situation. Had he merely stood over the meat, head up and glowering, White Fang would ultimately have slunk away. But the fresh meat was strong in Basik's nostrils, and greed urged him to take a bite of it. This was too much for White Fang. Fresh upon his months of mastery over his own teammates, it was beyond his self-control to stand idly by while another devoured the meat that belonged to him. He struck after his custom without warning. With the first slash, Basik's right ear was ripped into ribbons. He was astounded at the suddenness of it, but more things and more grievous ones were happening with equal suddenness. He was knocked off his feet. His throat was bitten. While he was struggling to his feet, the young dog sank teeth twice into his shoulder. The swiftness of it was bewildering. He made a futile rush at White Fang, clipping the empty air with his outraged snap. The next moment, his nose was laid upon, and he was staggering backward, away from the meat. The situation was now reversed. White Fang stood over the shin bone, bristling and menacing, while Basik stood a little way off, preparing to retreat. He dared not risk a fight with this young lightning flash. And again, he knew, and more bitterly, the enfeeblement of oncoming age. His attempt to maintain his dignity was heroic. Calmly turning his back upon young dog and Shinbone, as though both were beneath his notice, and unworthy of his consideration. He stalked grandly away, nor until well out of sight did he stop to lick his bleeding wounds. The effect on White Fang was to give him a greater faith in himself and a greater pride. He walked less softly among the grown dogs. His attitude toward them was less compromising. Not that he went out of his way looking for trouble, far from it, but upon his way he demanded consideration. He stood upon his right to go his way, unmolested, and to give trail to no dog. He had to be taken into account. That was all. He was no longer to be disregarded and ignored. As was the lot of puppies, and as continued to be the lot of the puppies that were his teammates. They got out of the way, gave trail to the grown dogs, and gave up meat to them under compulsion. But White Fang, uncomparable, solitary, morose, scarcely looking to right or left, unredoubtable, forbidding of aspect, remote and alien, was accepted as an equal by his puzzled elders. They quickly learned to leave him alone, neither venturing hostile acts nor making overtures of friendliness. If they left him alone, he left them alone. A state of affairs that they found after a few encounters to be preeminently desirable. In midsummer, White Fang had an experience trotting along in his silent way to investigate a new teepee which had been erected on the edge of the village, while he was away with the hunters after a moose. He came full upon Quiche. He paused and looked at her. He remembered her vaguely, but he remembered her. And that was more than could be said for her. She lifted her lip at him in the old snarl of menace, and his memory became clear. His forgotten cubhood, all that was associated with that familiar snarl, rushed back to him. Before he had known the gods, she had been to him the centerpin of the universe. The old familiar feelings of that time came back upon him, surged up within him. He bounded toward her joyously, and she met him with shrewd fangs that laid his cheek open to the bone. He did not understand. He backed away, bewildered and puzzled. But it was not Quiche's fault. A wolf mother was not made to remember her cubs of a year or so before, so she did not remember White Fang. He was a strange animal, an intruder, and a present litter of puppies gave her the right to resent such intrusion. One of the puppies sprawled up to White Fang. They were half-brothers, only they did not know it. White Fang sniffed the puppy curiously, whereupon Quiche rushed upon him. Gashing his face a second time, he backed further away. All the old memories and associations died down again, and passed into the grave from which they had been resurrected. He looked at Quiche, licking her puppy, and stopping now and then to snarl at him. She was without value to him. He had learned to get along without her. Her meaning was forgotten. There was no place for her in the scheme of things, as there was no place for him in hers. He was still standing, stupid and bewildered. The memory is forgotten, wondering what it was all about, when Quiche attacked him a third time, intent on driving him away altogether from the vicinity, and White Fang allowed himself to be driven away. This was a female of his kind, and it was a law of his kind that the males must not fight the females. He did not know anything about this law, for it was no generalization of the mind, not a something acquired by experience in the world. He knew it as a secret prompting, as an urge of instinct, of the same instinct that made him howl at the moon and stars at nights, and they made him fear death and the unknown. The months went by. White Fang grew stronger, heavier, and more compact, with his character was developing along the lines laid down by his hereditary and his environment. His heredity was the life stuff that may be likened to clay. It possessed many possibilities, was capable of being molded into many different forms. Environment served to model the clay, to give it a particular form. Thus, had White Fang never come into the fires of man, the wild would have molded him into a true wolf. But the gods had given him a different environment, and he was molded into a dog. That was rather wolfish, but that was a dog and not a wolf. And so, according to the clay of his nature and the pressure of his surroundings, his character was being molded into a certain particular shape. There was no escaping it. He was becoming more morose, more uncompanionable, more solitary, more ferocious, while the dogs were learning more and more that it was better to be at peace with him than at war, and Grey Beaver was coming to prize him more greatly with the passage of each day, White Fang seeming to sum up strength in all his qualities, nevertheless suffered from one besetting weakness. He could not stand being laughed at. The laughter of men was a hateful thing. They might laugh among themselves about anything they pleased except himself, and he did not mind. But the moment laughter was turned upon him, he would fly into a most terrible rage. Brave, dignified, somber, a laugh made him frantic to ridiculousness. So it was It so outraged him and upset him that for hours he would behave like a demon, and woe to the dog that at such times ran foul of him. He knew the law too well to take it out on Grey Beaver. Behind Grey Beaver were a club and Godhead, but behind the dogs there was nothing but space, and into this space they fled when White Fang came on the scene, made mad by laughter. In the third year of his lifetime there came a great famine to the Mackenzie Indians. In the summer the fish failed, in the winter the caribou forsook their accustomed track. Moose were scarce, the rabbits also almost disappeared. Hunting and preying animals perished. Denied their usual food supply, weakened by hunger, they fell upon and devoured one another. Only the strong survived. White Fang's gods were always hunting animals. The old and the weak of them died of hunger. There was wailing in the village, where the women and children went without in order that what little they had might go into the bellies of the lean and hollowed hunters, who trod the forest in the vain pursuit of meat. To such extremity were the gods driven that they ate the soft-tanned leather of their moccasins and mittens, while the dogs ate the harnesses off their backs, and the very whiplashes also. The dogs ate one another, and also the gods ate the dogs. The weakest and the more worthless were eaten first. The dogs that still lived looked on and understood. A few of the boldest and wisest forsook the fires of the gods, which had now become a shambles, and fled into the forest, where in the end they starved to death or were eaten by wolves. In this time of misery, White Fang too stole away into the woods. He was better fitted for the life than the other dogs, for he had the training of his cubhood to guide him. Especially adept did he become in stalking small living things. He would lie concealed for hours, following every movement of a cautious tree squirrel, waiting with a patience as huge as the hunger he suffered from, until the squirrel ventured out upon the ground. Even then White Fang was not premature. He waited until he was sure of striking before the squirrel could gain a tree refuge. Then, and not until then, would he flash from his hiding place a gray projectile incredibly swift, never failing its mark. The fleeing squirrel that fled not fast enough. Successful as he was with squirrels, there was one difficulty that prevented him from living and growing fat on them. There were not enough squirrels, so he was driven to hunt still smaller things. So acute did his hunger become at times that he was not above rooting out wood mice from their burrows in the ground. Nor did he scorn to do battle with a weasel as hungry as himself, and many times more ferocious. In the worst pinches of the famine, he stole back to the fires of the clouds, but he did not go into the fires. He lurked in the forest, avoiding discovery and robbing the snares of the rare intervals when game was caught. He even robbed Grey Beaver's snare of a rabbit, at a time when Grey Beaver staggered and tottered through the forest, sitting down often to rest, what of weakness and of shortness of breath. One day White Fang encountered a young wolf, gaunt and scrawny, loose-jointed with famine. Had he not been hungry himself, White Fang might have gone with him, and eventually found his way into the pack amongst his wild brother. As it was, he ran the young wolf down and killed and ate him. Fortune seemed to favor him. Always when hardest pressed for food, he found himself he found something to kill. Again, when he was weak, it was his luck that none of the larger preying animals chanced upon him. Thus he was strong from the 2 days eating a lynx had afforded him when the hungry wolf pack ran full tilt upon him. It was a long, cruel chase, but he was better nourished than they, and in the end outran them. And not only did he outrun them, but circling widely back on his track, he gathered in one of his exhausted pursuers. After that, he left that part of the country and journeyed over to the valley wherein he had been born. Here in the old lair he encountered Quiche, up to her old tricks. She too had fled the inhospitable fires of the gods and gone back to her old refuge to give birth to a young. Of this litter, but one remained alive. When White Fang came upon the scene, and this was not destined to live long, young life had little chance in such a famine. Cunché's greeting of her grown son was anything but affectionate, but White Fang did not mind. He had outgrown his mother, so he turned tail philosophically and trotted on up the street. At the forks he took the turning to the left, where he found the lair of the lynx with whom his mother and he had fought long before. Here, in the abandoned lair, he settled down and rested for a day. During the early summer, in the last days of the famine, he met Lip Lip, who had likewise taken to the woods, where he had eked out a miserable existence. White Fang came upon him unexpectedly, trotting in opposite directions along the base of a high bluff. They rounded a corner of rock and found themselves face to face. They paused with instant alarm and looked at each other suspiciously. White Fang was in splendid condition. His hunting had been good, and for a week he had eaten his fill. He was even gorged from his latest kill, but in the moment he looked at Lip Lip, his hair rose on end, all along his back. It was an involuntary bristling on his part, the physical state that in the past had always accompanied the mental state produced in him by Lip Lip's bullying and persecution. As in the past he had bristled and snarled at sight of Lip Lip, so now and automatically he bristled and snarled. He did not waste any time. The thing was done thoroughly and with dispatch. Lip Lip essayed to back away, but White Fang struck him hard shoulder to shoulder. Lip Lip was overthrown. One moment. Speaking of dogs, I had to calm mine down. So where were we? Page 817. All right, let us continue. and rolled upon his back. White Fang's teeth drove into the scrawny throat. There was a death struggle, during which White Fang walked around, stiff-legged and observant. Then he resumed his course and trotted on along the base of the bluff. One day, not long after, give me a moment, I'm going to go ahead and check that I made sure that I was reading those last few last few pages. Give me a moment, sorry. Sorry about that. The dog check kind of threw me off my game. Let's continue. One day, not long after, he came to the edge of the forest, where a narrow stretch of open land sloped down to the Mackenzie. He had been over this ground before, when it was bare, but now a village occupied it. Still hidden amongst the trees, he paused to study the situation. Sights and sounds and scents were familiar to him. It was the old village changed to a new place, but sights and sounds and smells were different from those he had last had when he fled away from it. There was no whimpering nor wailing. Contented sounds saluted his ear, and when he heard the angry voice of a woman, he knew it to be the anger that proceeds from a full stomach, and there was a smell in the air of fish. There was food. The famine was gone. He came out boldly from the forest and trotted into camp straight to Grey Beaver's teepee. Grey Beaver was not there. Blue Cooch welcomed him with glad cries and the whole of a fresh caught fish, and he lay down to wait Grey Beaver's coming. Chapter break. And let's continue. Part 4. Chapter 1. The Enemy of His Kind. Had there been in White Fang's nature any possibility, no matter how remote, of his ever coming to fraternize with his kind, such possibility was irretrievably destroyed when he was made leader of the sled team. For now the dogs hated him for the extra meat bestowed upon him. By Mitsa hated him with all the real and fancied favors he received. Hated him for that he fled away at the head of the team. His waving brush of a tail and his perpetually retreating hindquarters were ever maddening their eyes. And White Fang just as bitterly hated them back. Being sled leader was anything but gratifying to him. To be compelled to run away before the yelling pack, every dog of which for 3 years he had thrashed and mastered, was almost more than he could endure. but endure it he must or perish, and the life that was in him had no desire to perish out. The moment Mitzah gave his order for the start, that moment the whole team, with eager, savage cries, sprang forward at White Fang. There was no defense for him if he turned upon them. Mitzah would throw the stinging lash of the whip onto his face. Only remained to him to run away. He could not encounter that howling horde with his tail and hindquarters. These were scarcely fit weapons with which to meet the many merciless things, so run away he did, violating his own nature and pride with every leap he made, and leaping all day long. One cannot violate the promptings of one's nature without having that nature recoil upon itself. Such a recoil is like that of a hare, made to grow out from the body, turning unnaturally upon the direction of its growth, and growing into the body. A rankling, festering thing of hurt. And so, with White Fang, every urge of his being impelled him to spring upon the pack that cried at his heels. But it was the will of the gods that this should not be, and behind the wheel to enforce it was the whip of Caribou Gut, with its biting 30-foot lash. So White Fang could only eat his heart in bitterness, and develop a hatred and malice commensurate with the ferocious and indomitable ability of his nature. If ever a creature was the enemy of its kind, White Fang was that creature. He asked no quarter, gave none. He was continually marred and scarred by the teeth of the pack, and as continually he left his own marks upon the pack. Unlike most leaders who, when camp was made and the dogs were unhitched, huddled near the gods for protection, White Fang disdained such protection. He walked boldly about the camp, inflicting punishment in the night for what he had suffered in the day. In the time before he was made leader of the team, the pack had learned to get out of his way. But now it was different, excited by the day-long pursuit of him, swayed subconsciously by the insistent iteration on their brains of the sight of him, fleeing away, mastered by the feeling of mastery enjoyed all day. The dogs could not bring themselves to give way to him. When he appeared amongst them, there was always a squabble. His progress was marked. His progress was marked by snarl and snap and growl. The very atmosphere he breathed was surcharged with hatred and malice, and this but served to increase the hatred and malice within him. When Mitzah cried out his command for the team to stop, White Fang obeyed. At first this caused trouble for the other dogs. All of them would spring upon the hated leader, only to find the tables turned. Behind him would be Mitzah, the great whip swinging in his hand. So the dogs came to understand that when the team stopped by order, White Fang was to be let alone. But when White Fang stopped without orders, then it was allowed them to spring upon him and destroy him if they could. After several experiences, White Fang never stopped without orders. He learned quickly it was in the nature of them that he must learn quickly. If he were to survive the unusually severe conditions under which life was vouchsafed him, but the dogs could never learn the lesson to leave him alone in camp. Each day pursuing him and crying defiance at him, the lesson of the previous night was erased, and that night would have to be learned over again, to be as immediately forgotten. Besides, there was a greater consistence in their dislike of him. They sensed between themselves and him a difference of kind, cause sufficient in itself for hostility. Like him, they were domesticated wolves. But they had been domesticated for generations. Much of the wild had been lost, so that to them the wild was the unknown, the terrible, the ever menacing and ever wearing. But to him, in appearance and action and impulse, still clung the wild. He symbolized it, was its personification, so that when they showed their teeth to him, they were defending themselves against the powers of destruction that lurked in the shadows of the forest and in the talk beyond the campfire. But there was one lesson the dogs did learn, and that was to keep together. White Fang was too terrible for any of them to face single-handed. They met him with the mass formation, otherwise he would have killed them, one by one. In a night as it was, he never had a chance to kill them. He might roll a dog off its feet, but the pack would be upon him before he could follow up and deliver the deadly throat stroke. At the first hint of conflict, the whole team drew together and faced him. The dogs had quarreled among themselves, but these were forgotten when the trouble was brewing with White Fang. On the other hand, try as they would, they could not kill White Fang. He was too quick for them, too formidable, too wise. He avoided tight places, and always backed out of it when they bade fair to surround him. While as for getting him off his feet, there was no dog among them capable of doing the trick. His feet clung to the earth with the same tenacity that he clung to life. For that matter, life and footing were synonymous in this unending warfare with the pack, and none knew it better than White Fang. So he became the enemy of his kind. Domesticated wolves that they were, softened by the fires of man, weakened in the sheltering shadow of man's strength. White Fang was bitter and implacable. The clay of him was so molded, he declared a vendetta against all dogs. And so terribly did he live this vendetta that Grey Beaver, fierce savage himself, could not but marvel at White Fang's ferocity. Never, he swore, had there been the like of this animal, and the Indians in strange villages swore likewise when they considered the tale of his killings amongst their dogs. When White Fang was nearly 5 years old, Grey Beaver took him on another great journey, and long remembered was the havoc he worked amongst the dogs of the many villages along the Mackenzie. Across the Rockies and down the Porcupine to the Yukon, he reveled in the vengeance he wreaked upon his kind. They were ordinary, unsuspecting dogs. They were not prepared for his swiftness and directness. For his attack without warning, they did not know him for what he was, a lightning flash of slaughter. They bristled up to him, stiff-legged and challenging, while he, wasting no time on elaborate preliminaries, snapping into action like a steel spring, was at their throats and destroying them before they knew what was happening. And while they were yet in the throes of surprise, he became an adept at fighting. He economized. He never wasted his strength, never tussled. He was in too quickly for that, and if he missed, was out again too quickly. The dislike of the wolf for close quarters was his to an unusual degree. He could not endure a prolonged contact with another body. It smacked of danger. It made him frantic. He must be away free on his own legs, touching no living animal. It was the wild still clinging to him, asserting itself through him. This feeling had been accentuated by the Ishmaelite life he had led from his puppyhood. Danger lurked in contacts. It was the trap, ever the trap, the fear of its lurking deep in the life of him, woven into the fibre of him. In consequence, the strange dogs he encountered had no chance against him. He eluded their fangs, he got them or got away himself, untouched in either event. In the natural course of things, there were exceptions to this. There were times when several dogs pitching onto him punished him before he could get away, and there were times when a single dog scored deeply on him. But these were accidents. In the main, so efficient a fighter had he become. He went his way unscathed. Another advantage he possessed was that of correctly judging time and distance. Not that he did this consciously, however, he did not calculate such things. It was all automatic. His eyes saw correctly, and the nerves carried the vision correctly to his brain. The parts of him were better adjusted than those of the average dog. They worked together more smoothly and steadily. His was a better, far better nervous, mental, and muscular coordination when his eyes conveyed to his brain the moving image of an action. His brain, without conscious effort, knew the space that limited that action and the time required for its completion. Thus he could avoid the leap of another dog, or the drive of its fangs, and at the same moment would seize the infinitesimal fraction of time in which to deliver his own attack. Body and brain, his was a more perfected mechanism. Not that he was to be praised for it. Nature had been more generous to him than to the average animal. That was all. It was in the summer that White Fang arrived at Fort Yukon. Grey Beaver had crossed the great watershed between the Mackenzie and the Yukon in the late winter and spent the spring in hunting among the western outlying spurs of the Rockies. Then, after the breakup of the ice on the Porcupine, he had built a canoe and paddled down that stream to where it effected its junction with the Yukon just under the Arctic Circle. Here stood the old Hudson Bay Company fort, and here were many Indians, much food, and unprecedented excitement. It was the summer of 1898, and thousands of gold hunters were going up the Yukon to Dawson and the Klondike. Still hundreds of miles from their goal, nevertheless, many of them had been on the way for a year, and the least any of them had traveled to get that far was 5,000 miles. While some had come from the other side of the world, here Grey Beaver stopped. A whisper of the gold rush had reached his ears, and he had come with several bales of furs, and another of gutsoon mittens and moccasins. He would not have ventured so long a trip had he not expected generous profits. But what he had expected was nothing to what he realized. His wildest dream had not exceeded 100% profit. He made 1,000%, and like a true Indian, he settled down to trade carefully and slowly, even if it took all summer, and the rest of the winter to dispose of his goods. It was at Fort Yukon that White Fang saw his first white men. As compared with the Indians he had known, they were to him another race of beings, a race of superior gods. They impressed him as possessing superior power, and it is on what power that Godhead rests. White Fang did not reason it out. did not in his mind make the sharp generalization that the white gods were more powerful. It was a feeling, nothing more, and yet none the less potent as in his puppyhood the looming bulks of the TV's man reared half affectionate him as manifestations of power. So was he affected now by the houses and the huge fort. Gonna take the break, or ad break. Let me explain to those who are new to this and are watching the VOD. I take these breaks because Twitch has the system of either you get people get advertisements when they join into the stream, or they get advertisements a certain amount of time per hour. For example, we now have an ad in progress. So it was either this or everyone gets ads when they join. And I think I don't want anyone to miss content. So that's why we're taking a break here. And I'll be right back. All right, everyone, welcome back. I also had a bit of a hydration, so my throat should be good for a little while. I'll still take my chapter break just in case, though. all of massive logs. Here was power. Those white gods were strong. They possessed greater mastery over matter than the gods he had known. Most powerful among which was Grey Beaver, and yet Grey Beaver was as a child god among these white-skinned ones. To be sure, White Fang only felt these things, he was not conscious of them. Yet it is upon feeling more often than thinking that animals act, and every act White Fang now performed was based upon the feeling that the white men were the superior gods in the first place. He was very suspicious of them. There was no telling what unknown terrors were theirs, what unknown hurts they could administer. He was curious to observe them, fearful of being noticed by them. But the first few hours he was content with slinking around them and watching them from a safe distance. Then he saw that no harm befell the dogs that were near to them, and he came in closer. In turn, he was an object of great curiosity to them. His wolfish appearance caught their eyes at once, and they pointed him out to one another. This act of pointing put White Fang on his guard, and when they tried to approach him, he showed his teeth and backed away. Not one succeeded in laying a hand on him, and it was well that they did not. White Fang soon learned that very few of these gods, not more than a dozen, lived at this place. Every 2 or 3 days, a steamer, another and colossal manifestation of power, came into the bank and stopped for several hours. The white men came from off these steamers, and went away on them again. There seemed untold numbers of these white men. In the first day or so he saw more of them than he did see Indians in all his life. And as the days went by, they continued to come up the river, stop, and then go on up the river, and out of sight. But the white gods were all powerful. Their dogs did not amount to much. This White Fang quickly discovered by mixing with those that came ashore with their masters. They were of irregular shape and sizes. Some were short-legged, too short, others were long-legged, too long. They had hair instead of fur, and a few had very little hair at that, and none of them knew how to fight. As an enemy of his kind, it was in White Fang's providence to fight with them. This he did, and he quickly achieved for them a mighty contempt. They were soft and helpless, made much noise, and floundered around clumsily, trying to accomplish by main strength what he accomplished by dexterity and cunning. They rushed bellowing at him. He sprang to the side. They did not know what had become of him, and in that moment he struck them on the shoulder, rolling them off their feet and delivering his stroke at the throat. Sometimes the stroke was successful, and a stricken dog rolled in the dirt, to be pounced upon and torn to pieces by the pack of Indian dogs that waited. White Fang was wise. He had learned He had long since learned that the gods were made angry when their dogs were killed. The white man was no exception to this. So he was content when he had overthrown and slashed wide the throat of one of their dogs, to drop back and let the pack go in and do the cruel finishing work. It was then that the white men rushed in, visiting their wrath heavily on the pack. While White Fang went free, he would stand off at a little distance and look on while stones, clubs, axes, and all sorts of weapons fell upon his fellows. White Fang was very wise, but his fellows grew wise in their own way, and in this White Fang grew wise with them. They learned that it was when a steamer first tied to the bank that they had their fun, After the first 2 or 3 strange dogs had been downed and destroyed, the white men hustled their own animals back on board and wreaked savage vengeance on the offenders. One white man, having seen his dog, a setter, torn to pieces before his eyes, drew a revolver. He fired rapidly 6 times, and 6 of the pack lay dead or dying, another manifestation of power that sank deep into White Fang's consciousness. White Fang enjoyed it all, did not love his kind, and he was shrewd enough to escape hurt himself. At first, the killing of the white men's dogs had been a diversion. After a time, it became his occupation. There was no work for him to do. Grey Weaver was busy trading and getting wealthy. So White Fang hung around the landings with the disreputable gang of Indian dogs, waiting for steamers. With the arrival of a steamer, the fun began. After a few minutes, by the time the white men had got over their surprise, the gang scattered. The fun was over until the next steamer should arrive, but it can scarcely be said that White Fang was a member of the gang. He did not mingle with it, but remained aloof, always himself, and was even feared by it. It is true he worked with it. He picked the quarrel with the strange dog, while the gang waited, and when he had overthrown the strange dog, the gang went in to finish it. But it is equally true that he then withdrew, leaving the gang to receive the punishment of the outraged gods. It did not require much exertion to pick these quarrels. All he had to do when the strange dogs came ashore was to show himself when they saw him. They rushed for him. It was the instinct. He was the wild, the unknown, the terrible, and ever menacing. The thing that prowled in the darkness, around the fires of the primeval world. When they, cowering close to the fires, were reshaping their instincts, learning to fear the wild out of which they had come, and which they had deserted and betrayed. Generation by generation, down all the generations, had this fear of the wild been stamped into their natures. For centuries the wild had stood for terror and destruction, and during all this time free license had been theirs. From this from their masters to kill the things of the wild. In doing this they had protected both themselves and the gods whose companionship they shared. And so, fresh from the soft southern world, these dogs, trotting down the gangplank and out upon the Yukon shore, had but to see White Fang to experience the irresistible impulse to rush upon him and destroy him. They might be town-reared dogs, but the instinctive fear of the wild was theirs. Just the same, not alone with their own eyes did they see the wolfish creature in the clear light of day, standing before them. They saw him with the eyes of their ancestors. By their inherited memory, they knew White Fang for the wolf, and they remembered the ancient feud. All of which served to make White Fang's days enjoyable. If the sight of him drove these strange dogs upon him, so much the better for him, so much the worse for them. They looked upon him as legitimate prey. It is legitimate prey he looked upon them. Not for nothing, he had first seen the light of day in a lonely lair and fought his first fights with the pteromidon, the weasel, and the lynx. And not for nothing had his puppyhood been made bitter by the persecution of Lip Lip and the whole puppy pack. It might have been otherwise, and he would then have been otherwise, but Lip Lip not existed. He would have passed his puppyhood with the other puppies and grown up more dog-like, and with more liking for dogs. Had Grey Weaver possessed the plummet of affection and love, he might have sounded the deeps of White Fang's nature and brought up to the surface all manner of kindly qualities. But these things had not been so. The clay of White Fang had been molded until he became what he was, morose and lonely, unloving and ferocious, the enemy of all his kind. Chapter break. Chapter 2. The Mad God. A small number of white men lived in Fort Yukon. These men had been long in the country. They called themselves sourdoughs, and took great pride in so classifying themselves. For other men new in the land, they felt nothing but disdain. The men who came ashore from the steamers were newcomers. They were known as chi chak boas. I don't know what that means, but okay. Uh, this is signifying that because I don't want to say anything offensive. And they always willed, and they always wilted at the application of the name. They made their bread with baking powder. This was the invidious distinction between them. And the sourdoughs, who forsooth made their bread from sourdough because they had no baking powder. All of which is neither here nor there. The men in the fort disdained the newcomers and enjoyed seeing them come to grief. Especially did they enjoy the havoc worked amongst the newcomers. Dogs, by White Fang and his disreputable gang. When a steamer arrived, the men of the fort made it a point always to come down to the bank and see the fun. They looked forward to it with as much anticipation as did the Indian dogs. While they were not slow to appreciate the savage and crafty part played by White Fang, but there was one man amongst them who particularly enjoyed the sport. He would come running at the first sound of a steamboat's whistle. And when the last fight was over, and White Fang and the pack had scattered, he would slowly return to the fort, his face heavy with regret. Sometimes when a soft Southland dog went down, shrieking its death cry under the fangs of the pack, this man would be unable to contain himself, and would leap into the air and cry out with delight. And always he had a sharp and covetous eye for White Fang. This man was called Beauty by the other men of the fort. No one knew his first name. In general, he was known in this country as Beauty Smith, but he was anything save a beauty. To antithesis was due his naming. He was pre-eminently unbeautiful. Nature had been terrible with him. He was a small man to begin with, and upon his meager frame was deposited an even more striking meager head. Its apex might be likened to a point. In fact, in his boyhood, before he had been named Beauty by his fellows, he had been called Pinhead. Backward from the apex, his head slanted down to his neck, and forward it slanted uncompromisingly, to meet a low and remarkable wide forehead, beginning here as though regretting her parsimony, nature had spread his features with a lavish hand. His eyes were large, and between them was the distance of two eyes. His face in relation to the rest of him was prodigious. In order to discover the necessary area. Nature had given him an enormous jaw. It was wide and heavy, and protruded outward and down until it seemed to rest on his chest. Possibly this appearance was due to the weariness of the slender neck, unable properly to support so great a burden. This jaw gave the this jaw gave the impression of ferocious determination. But something lacked. Perhaps it was from excess. Perhaps the jaw was too large. At any rate, it was a lie. Beauty Smith was known far and wide as the weakest of weak kneed and sniveling cowards. To complete his description, his teeth were large and yellow, while the two eye teeth, larger than the fellows, showed under his lean lips like fangs. His eyes were yellow and muddy, as though nature had run short on pigments and squeezed together the dregs of all her tubes. It was the same with his hair, sparse and irregular, of growth, muddy yellow and dirty yellow, rising on his head and sprouting out of his face in unexpected tufts and bunches in appearance like clumped and wind-blown grain. In short, Beauty Smith was a monstrosity, and the blame for it lay elsewhere. He was not responsible. The clay of him had been so molded in making he did not cook for the other men in the fort. The dishwashing and the drudgery, they did not despise him. Rather did they tolerate him in a broad human way, as one tolerates any creature evilly treated in the making. Also they feared him. His cowardly rages made them dread a shot in the back or poison in their coffee. But somebody had to do the cooking, and whatever else his shortcomings, Beauty Smith would cook. This was the man that looked at White Fang, delighted in his ferocious prowess, and desired to possess him. He made overtures to White Fang from the first. White Fang began by ignoring him. Later on, when the overtures became more insistent, White Fang bristled and bared his teeth and backed away. He did not like the man. The feeling of him was bad, and he sensed the evil in him, and feared the extended hand and the attempts at soft-spoken speech. Because of all this, he hated the man. With the simpler creatures, good and bad are things simply understood. The good stands for all things that bring easement and satisfaction, and surcease from pain. Therefore, the good is light. The bad stands for all things that are fraught with discomfort, menace, and hurt, and is hated accordingly. White Fang's feel of Beauty Smith was bad, from the man's distorted body and twisted mind, in occult ways like mist rising from malaria marshes, came emanations of the unwealth within, not by reasoning, not by the five senses alone, but by other and remoter and uncharted senses, came the feeling to White Fang that the man was ominous with evil, pregnant with hurtfulness, and therefore a thing bad and wisely to be hated. White Fang was in Grey Beaver's camp when Beauty Smith first visited. At the faint sound his distant feet before he came in sight. Beauty, uh, White Fang knew who was coming, and began to bristle. He had been lying down in an abandon of comfort, but he arose quickly, and as the man arrived, slid away in true wolf fashion to the edge of the camp. He did not know what they said, but he could see the man and Grey Beaver talking together. Once the man pointed at him, and White Fang snarled back, as though the hand were just descending upon him, instead of being, as it was, 50 feet away. The man laughed at this, and White Fang slunk away to the sheltering woods, his head turned to observe as he glided softly over the ground. Greybeaver refused to sell the dog. He had grown rich with his trading and stood in need of nothing. Besides, White Fang was a valuable animal, the strongest sled dog he had ever owned, and the best leader. Furthermore, there was no dog like him on the Mackenzie, nor the Yukon. He could fight, he killed other dogs as easily as men, killed mosquitoes. Beauty Smith's eyes lighted up at this, and he licked his thin lips with an eager tongue. No White Fang was not for sale, at any price. But Beauty Smith knew the ways of Indians. He visited Grey Beaver's camp often, and hidden under his coat was always a black bottle or so. One of the potencies of whiskey is the breeding of thirst. Grey Beaver got the thirst. His fevered membranes and burnt stomach began to clamor for more and more of the scorching fluid, while his brain thirsted away awry from the unwanted stimulant, permitted him to go any length to obtain it. The money he had received for his furs and mittens and moccasins began to go. It went faster and faster, and the shorter his money sack grew, the shorter grew his temper. In the end, his money and goods and temper were all gone. Nothing remained to him but his thirst, a prodigious possession in itself, that grew more prodigious with every sober breath he drew. Then it was that Beauty Smith had talked with him again about the sale of White Fang, but this time the price offered was in bottles, not dollars, and Grey Beaver's ears were more eager to hear. You catch dog, you take all right, was his last words. The bottles were delivered, but after 2 days, you catch dog, were Beauty Smith's words to Grey Beaver. White Fang slunk into camp one evening and dropped down with a sigh of relief. The dreaded white gods were not there. For days, his manifestations of desire to lay hands on him had been growing more insistent, and during that time White Fang had been compelled to avoid the camp. He did not know what evil was threatened by those insistent hands. He knew only that they did threaten evil of some sort, and that it was best for him to keep out of their reach. But scarcely had he lain down with Greyweaver, staggered over to him, and tied a leather thong around his neck. White Fang holding the end of the thong in his hand. In the other hand he held a bottle, which from time to time was inverted above his head, to the accompaniment of gurgling noises. An hour of this passed when the vibrations of feet in contact with the ground foreran the one who approached. White Fang heard it first, and he was bristling with recognition. While Grey Beaver still nodded stupidly, White Fang drew to draw the thong softly out of his master's hand, but the relaxed fingers closed tightly, and Grey Beaver roused himself. Beauty Smith strode into camp and stood over White Fang. He snarled softly up at the thing of fear, watching keenly on the deportment of his hands. One hand extended outwards and began to descend upon his head. His soft snarl grew tense and harshly. The hand continued slowly to descend, while he crouched beneath it, eyeing it malignantly, his snarl growing shorter and shorter as with quickening breath it approached its culmination. Suddenly he snapped, striking with his fangs like a snake. The hand was jerked back, and the teeth came together emptily, with a sharp flick. Beauty Smith was frightened and angry. Grey Beaver clouted White Fang alongside the head, so that he cowered down close to the earth in respectful obedience. White Fang's suspicious eyes followed every movement. He saw Beauty Smith go away and return with a stout club. Then the end of the thong was given over to him by Grey Beaver. Beauty Smith started to walk away. The thong grew taut. White Fang resisted it. Grey Beaver clouted him right and left to make him get up and follow. He obeyed with a rush, hurling himself upon the stranger who was dragging him away. Beauty Smith did not jump away. He had not. He had been waiting for this. He swung the club smartly, stopping the rush midway, smashing White Fang down upon the ground. Grey Beaver laughed and nodded approval. Beauty Smith tightened the thong again, and White Fang crawled limply and dazedly to his feet. He did not rush a second time. One smash from the club was sufficient to convince him that the white god knew how to handle it, and he was too wise to fight the inevitable, so he followed morosely at Beauty Smith's heels, his tail between his legs, yet snarling softly under his breath, but Beauty Smith kept a wary eye on him, and the club was held always ready to strike. At the fort, Beauty Smith left him securely tied and went in to bed. White Fang waited an hour, then he applied his teeth to the thong, and in the space of 10 seconds was free. He had wasted no time with his teeth. There was no useless gnawing. The thong was cut across diagonally, almost as clean as though done by a knife. White Fang looked up at the fort at the same time, bristling and growling. Then he turned and trotted back to Grey Beaver's camp. He owed no allegiance to the strange and terrible god. He had given himself to Grey Beaver, and to Grey Beaver he considered he still belonged. But what had occurred before was repeated, with a difference. Grey Beaver again made him fast with a thong, and in the morning turned him over to Beauty Smith. And here was where the difference came in. Beauty Smith gave him a beating. Tied securely, White Fang could only rage futilely and endure the punishment. Club and whip were both used upon him, and he experienced the worst beating he had ever received in his life. Even the big beating given him in his puppyhood by Grey Beaver was mild compared with this. Beauty Smith enjoyed the task. He delighted in it. He gloated over his victim, and his eyes flamed dully as he swung the whip or club and listened to White Fang's cries of pain, and to his helpless bellows and snarls. For Beauty Smith was cruel in the way that cowards are cruel, cringing and sniveling himself before the blows or angry speech of a man. He revenged himself in turn upon creatures weaker than he. All life likes power, and Beauty Smith was no exception. Denied the expression of power amongst his own kind, he fell back upon the lesser creatures, and there vindicated the life that was in him. But Beauty Smith had not created himself, and no blame was to be attached to him. He had come into the world with a twisted body and a brute intelligence. This had constituted the clay of him, and it had not been kindly molded by the world. White Fang knew why he was being beaten. When Grey Beaver tied the thong around his neck and passed the end of the thong into Beauty Smith's keeping, White Fang knew that it was his god's will for him to go with Beauty Smith, and when Beauty Smith left him tied outside the fort, he knew that it was Beauty Smith's will that he should remain there. Therefore he had disobeyed the will of both the gods and earned the consequent punishment. He had seen dogs change owners in the past, and he had seen the runaways beaten as he was being beaten. He was wise, and yet in the nature of him there were forces greater than wisdom. One of these was fidelity. He did not love Greybeaver, yet even in the face of his will and his anger, he was faithful to him. He could not help it. This faithfulness was the quality of the clay that composed him. It was the quality that was peculiarly the possession of his kind, the quality that set apart his species from all other species, the quality that had enabled the wolf and the wild dog to come in from the open and be the companions of man. After the beating, White Fang was dragged back to the fort, but this time Beauty Smith left him tied with a stick. One does not one does not give up a god easily. And so with White Fang grew Greybeaver was his own particular god, and in spite of Greybeaver's will, White Fang still clung to him and would not give him up. Greybeaver had betrayed and forsaken him, but that had no effect upon him. Not for nothing had he surrendered himself body and soul to Greybeaver. There had been no reservation on White Fang's part, and the bond was not to be broken easily. So in the night, when the men in the fort were asleep, White Fang applied his teeth to the stick that held him. The wood was seasoned and dry, and it was tied so closely to his neck that he could scarcely get his teeth to it. It was only by the severest muscular exertion and neck arching that he succeeded in getting the wood between his teeth, and barely between his teeth at that. And it was opened by the exercise of an immense patience, extending through many hours, that he succeeded in gnawing through the stick. This was something that dogs were not supposed to do. It was unprecedented, but White Fang did it, trotting away from the fort in the early morning with the end of the stick hanging to his neck. He was wise, but had he been merely wise, he would not have gone back to Greybeaver, who had already twice betrayed him. But there was his faithfulness, and he went back to be betrayed yet a third time. Again he yielded to the tying of a thong around his neck by Greybeaver, and again Beauty Smith came to claim him, and this time he was beaten even more severely than before. Greybeaver looked on stolidly while the white man wielded the whip. He gave no protection. It was no longer his dog. When the beating was over, White Fang was sick. A soft Southland dog would have died under it, but not he. His school of life had been sterner, and he was himself of sterner stuff. He had too great vitality, his clutch on life was too strong, but he was very sick. At first, he was unable to drag himself along. Beauty Smith had to wait half an hour on him, and then, blind and reeling, he followed at Beauty Smith's heels back to the fort. But now he was tied with a chain that defied his teeth, and he strove in vain by lunging to draw the staple from the timber into which it was driven. After a few days, sober and bankrupt, Beaver departed up the Porcupine on his long journey to the Mackenzie. White Fang remained on the Yukon, the property of a man more than half mad and all brute. But what is a dog to know in its consciousness of madness? To White Fang, Beauty Smith was a terrible god. He was a mad god at best, but White Fang knew nothing of madness. He knew only that he must submit to the will of this new master, obey his every whim and fancy. Chapter break. All right. Chapter 3. The Reign of Hate. Under the tutelage of the Mad God, White Fang became a friend. He was kept chained in a pen at the rear of the fort, and here Beauty Smith teased and irritated and drove him wild with petty torments. The man early discovered White Fang's susceptibility to laughter, and made it a point, after painfully tricking him, to laugh at him. This laughter was uproared and scornful, but at the same time the god pointed his finger derisively at White Fang. At such times reason fled from White Fang, and in his transports of rage he was even more mad than Beauty Smith. Formerly White Fang had been merely an enemy of his kind, with all a ferocious enemy. He now became the enemy of all things, and more ferociously than ever, to such an extent that he hated blindly, and without the faintest spark of reason, he hated the men who peered in at him through the slats of the pen. The dogs that accompanied the men, and that snarled malignantly at him in his helplessness. He hated the very wood of the pen that confined him, and first, last, and most of all, he hated Beauty Smith. But Beauty Smith had been a purpose in all that he did. But Beauty Smith had a purpose in all that he did to White Fang. One day a number of men gathered about the pen. Beauty Smith entered, club in hand, and took the chain from off White Fang's neck. When his master had gone out, White Fang turned loose and tore around the pen, trying to get at the men outside. He was magnificently terrible, fully 5 feet in length, standing 2½ feet at the shoulder. He far outweighed a wolf of corresponding size. From his mother he had inherited the heavy proportions of the dog, so that he weighed without any fat and without an ounce of superfluous flesh. Over 90 pounds, it was all muscle, bone, and sinew, fighting flesh in the finest condition. The door of the pen was being opened again. White Fang paused. Something unusual was happening. He waited. The door was opened wider. Then a huge dog was thrust inside, and the door was slammed shut behind him. White Fang had never seen such a dog. It was a mastiff, but the size and fierce aspect of the intruder did not deter him. Here was something not wood nor iron upon which to wreak his hate. He leaped in with a flash of fangs that ripped down the side of the mastiff's neck. The mastiff shook his head, growled hoarsely, and plunged at White Fang. But White Fang was here, there, and everywhere, always evading and eluding, and always leaping in and slashing with his fangs, and leaping out again in time to escape punishment. The men outside shouted and applauded, while Beauty Smith, in an ecstasy of delight, gloated over the ripping and mangling performed by White Fang. There was no hope for the mastiff. From the first... One moment. I'm going to look how big a mastiff dog is. Pretty good sized dog. No hope for the Mastiff from the first. He was too ponderous and slow. In the end, while Beauty Smith beat White Fang back with a club, the Mastiff was dragged out by its owner. Then there was a payment of bets, and money clinked in Beauty Smith's hand. White Fang came to look forward eagerly to the gathering of the men around his pen. It meant a fight, and this was the only way that was now vouchsafed him of expressing the life that was in him, tormented and incited to hate. He was kept a prisoner so that there was no way of satisfying that hate except at the times his master saw fit to put another dog against him. Beauty Smith had estimated his powers well, for he was invariably the victor. One day 3 dogs were turned in upon him in succession. Another day a full-grown wolf, fresh caught from the wild, he shoved in through the door of the pen, and on still another day 2 dogs were set against him at the same time. This was his severest fight, and though in the end he killed them both, he was himself half killed in doing it. In the fall of the year, when the first snows were falling and mush ice was running in the river, Beauty Smith took passage for himself, and White Fang was White Fang on a steamboat bounded up the Yukon to Dawson. White Fang had now achieved a reputation in the land as the Fighting Wolf. He was known far and wide, and the cage in which he was kept on the steamboat's deck was usually surrounded by curious men. He raged and snarled at them, or lay quietly and studied them with cold hatred. Why should he not hate them? He never asked himself the question. He knew only hate, and lost himself in the passion of it. Life had become a hell to him. He had not been made for the close confinement wild beasts endure at the hands of men, and yet it was in precisely this way that he was treated. Men stared at him, poked sticks between the bars to make him snarl, and then laughed at him. They were his environment, these men, and they were molding the clay of him into a more ferocious thing than had been intended by nature. Nevertheless, nature had given him plasticity, where many another animal would have died, or had its spirit broken. He adjusted himself and lived, and at no expense of the spirit, possibly. Beauty Smith, archfiend and tormentor, was capable of breaking White Fang's spirit, but as yet there were no signs of succeeding. If Beauty Smith had in him a devil, White Fang had another, and the two of them raged against each other unceasingly in the days before. White Fang had the wisdom to cower down and submit to a man with a club in his hand. But this wisdom now left him. The mere sight of Beauty Smith was sufficient to send him into transports of fury. And when they came to close quarters and he had been beaten back by the club, he wasn't ungrowling and snarling, and showing his fangs. The last growl could never be extracted from him. No matter how terribly he was beaten, he had always another growl, and when Beauty Smith gave up and withdrew, the defiant growl followed after him. Or White Fang sprang at the bars of the cage, bellowing his hatred. When the steamboat arrived at Dawson, White Fang went ashore, but he still lived a public life, in a cage, surrounded by curious men. He was exhibited as the Fighting Wolf, and men paid 50 cents in gold dust to see him. He was given no rest. Did he lie down to sleep, he had stirred up by a sharp stick so that the audience might get its money's worth. In order to make the exhibition interesting, he was kept in a rage most of the time. But worse than all this was the atmosphere in which he lived. He was regarded as the most fearful of wild beasts, and this was borne into him through the bars of the cage. Every word, every cautious action on the part of the men impressed upon him his own terrible ferocity. It was so much added fuel to the flame of his fierceness, there could be but one result, and that was that his ferocity fed upon itself, and increased. It was another instance of the plasticity of his clay, of his capacity for being molded by the pressure of environment. In addition to being exhibited, he was a professional fighting animal. At regular intervals, whenever a fight could be arranged, he was taken out of his cage and led off into the woods, a few miles from town, usually the secured at night, so as to avoid interference from the mounted police of the territory. After a few hours of waiting, when daylight had come, the audience and the dog with which he was to fight arrived. In this manner it came about that he fought all sizes and breeds of dogs. It was a savage land. The men were savage, and the fights were usually to the death. Since White Fang continued to fight, it is obvious that it was the other dogs that died. He never knew defeat. His early training, when he fought with Lip Lip and the whole puppy pack, stood him in good stead. There was the tenacity with which he clung to the earth. No dog could make him lose his footing. This was the favorite trick of the wolf breeds, to rush in upon him, either directly or with an unexpected swerve, in the hope of striking his shoulder and overthrowing him. Mackenzie hounds, Eskimo and Labrador dogs, huskies and malamutes all tried it on him, and all failed. He was never known to lose his footing. Men told this to one another, and looked each time to see it happen. White Fang always disappointed them. Then there was his lightning quickness. It gave him a tremendous advantage over his antagonist. He no matter what their fighting experience, they had never encountered a dog that moved so swiftly as he. Also to be reckoned with was the immediateness of his attack. The average dog was accustomed to the preliminaries of snarlings and bristling and growling, and the average dog was knocked off his feet and finished before he had begun to fight, or recovered from his surprise. So often did this happen that it became the custom to hold White Fang until the other dog went through its preliminaries, was good and ready, and even made the first attack. The greatest of all the advantages in White Fang's favor was his experience. He knew more about fighting dogs than did any of the dogs that faced him. He had fought more fights, knew how to meet more tricks and methods, and had more tricks himself. While his own method was scarcely to be improved upon, as the time went by, he had fewer and fewer fights. Men despaired of matching him with an equal, and Beauty Smith was compelled to pit wolves against him. These were trapped by the Indians for the purpose, and a fight between White Fang and a wolf was always sure to draw a crowd. Once a full grown female lynx was secured, and this time White Fang fought for his life. Her quickness matched his, her ferocity equaled his. While he fought with his fangs alone, and she fought with her sharp clawed feet as well, but after the lynx all fighting ceased for White Fang. There was no more animals with which to fight. At least, there was none considered worthy of fighting with him. So he remained on exhibition until spring. Then one Tim Keenan a faro dealer arrived in the land. With him came the first bulldog that had ever entered the Klondike. That this dog and White Fang should come together was inevitable, and for a week the anticipated fight was the mainspring of conversation in certain quarters of the town. Chapter break. Chapter 4. The Clean Death. Beauty Smith slipped the chain from his neck and stepped back. For once, White Fang did not make an immediate attack. He stood still, ears pricked forward, alert and curious, surveying the strange animal that faced him. He had never seen such a dog before. Tim Keenan shoved the bulldog forward with a muttered "Go to it." The animal waddled toward the center of the circle. Short and squat and ungainly, he came to a stop and blinked across at White Fang. There were cries from the crowd of "Go to him, Cherokee! Sick him, Cherokee! Eat him up!" But Cherokee did not seem anxious to fight. He turned his head and blinked at the men who shouted, at the same time wagging his stump of a tail good-naturedly. He was not afraid, but merely lazy. Besides, it did not seem to him that it was intended he should fight with the dog. He saw before him. He was not used to fighting with that kind of a dog, and he was waiting for them to bring on the real dog. Tim Keenan stepped in and bent over Cherokee, fondling him on both sides of the shoulders with hands that rubbed against the grain of the hair and that made slight pushing forward movements. These were so many suggestions. Also, the effort was irritating, for Cherokee began to growl very softly deep down in his throat. There was a correspondence in rhythm between the growls and the movements of the man's hands. The growl rose in the throat with the culmination of each forwarding push, movement, and ebbed down to start up afresh with the beginning of the next movement. The end of each movement was the accent of the rhythm, the movement ending abruptly and the growling rising with a jerk. This was not without its effect on White Fang. The hair began to rise on his neck and across the shoulders. Tim Keenan gave a final shove forward and stepped back again as the impetus that carried Cherokee forward died down. He continued to go forward of his own volition in a swift, bow-legged run. Then White Fang struck a cry of startled admiration, went up. He had covered the distance and gone in more like a cat than a dog. And with the same cat-like swiftness he had slashed with his fangs and leaped clear. The bulldog was bleeding back of one ear from a rip in his thick neck. He gave no sign, did not even snarl, but turned and followed after White Fang. The display on both sides, the quickness of the one and the steadiness of the other, had excited the partisan spirit of the crowd, and the men were making new bets and increasing original bets. Again and yet again, White Fang sprang in, slashed and got away untouched, and still his strange foe followed after him without too great haste. Not slowly, but deliberately and determinedly, in a businesslike sort of way. There was purpose in his method, something for him to do that he was intent upon doing, and from which nothing could distract him. His whole demeanor, every action was stamped with this purpose. It puzzled White Fang. Never had he seen such a dog. It had no hair protection, it was soft and bled easily. There was no thick mat of fur to baffle. White Fang's teeth, as they were often baffled by dogs of his own breed, each time that his teeth struck, they sank easily into the yielding flesh, while the animal did not seem able to defend itself. Another disconcerting thing was that it made no outcry, such as he had been accustomed to with the other dogs he fought. I didn't want people to miss uh, any more of the story because of the ad. So let's go ahead and do be right back. Once again, I'll say this before we continue. For anyone watching the VOD, we're doing this because we're doing the ad break because Twitch has the system of either people will join and they'll get an immediate ad, which can stop people from being able to see the content, and is something that people will just be bummed about and probably leave. Um, or they can go ahead and we can have ad breaks. Uh, I'm Most people don't actually keep track of when that's going on, so they'll be showing something from their game, and then all of a sudden they'll have the ad break, and the viewers are just going to miss it. So that's also uh, something that can be disconcerting to viewers. So luckily, I do ad breaks, and I do a be right back when the ad is going on. It's either you join and you get an ad, or you get ad breaks intermediately. That's just how Twitch does it. But welcome back from said ad break. I was just explaining what the whole why we're doing ad breaks. I don't want anyone to miss any content, um, and I don't want to miss. I don't want to have people have to worry about going ahead and joining into watching the stream and watching an ad, like, because both of those things, I don't. Both of those things, you're going to miss content, and I'd prefer not to have you do that. So let's go ahead and get back into the game. I mean, back into the book. I'll be reading till page 1100. So I'll be taking breaks if there's a chapter break. But nope, there we go. Okay, back to the book. Beyond a growl or a grunt, the dog took its punishment silently, and never did it flag in its pursuit of him. Not that Cherokee was slow, but could turn and whirl swiftly enough. But White Fang was never there. Cherokee was puzzled too. He had never fought before with a dog with which he could not close. The desire to close had always been mutual, but here was a dog that kept at a distance, dancing and dodging here and there and about and all about. And when it did get its teeth into him, it did not hold on, but let go instantly and darted away again. But White Fang could not get at the soft underside of the throat. The bulldog stood too short. While its massive jaws were an added protection, White Fang darted in and out unscathed, while Cherokee's wounds increased. Both sides of his neck and head were ripped and slashed. He bled freely, but showed no signs of being disconcerted. His, he continued his plodding pursuit. Though once for the moment baffled, he came to a full stop and blinked at the men who looked on, at the same time wagging his stump of a tail as an expression of his willingness to fight. In that moment, White Fang was upon him and out, in passing, ripping his trimmed remnant of an ear. With a slight manifestation of anger, Cherokee took up the pursuit again, running on the inside of the circle. White Fang was making and striving to fasten his deadly grip on White Fang's throat. The bulldog missed by a hair's breadth, and cries of praise went up as White Fang doubled suddenly out of danger in the opposite direction. The time went by. White Fang still danced on, dodging and doubling, leaping in and out, and ever inflicting damage, and still the bulldog with grim certitude toiled after him. Sooner or later he would accomplish his purpose, get the grip that would win the battle. In the meantime, he accepted all the punishment the other could deal him. His tufts of ears had become tassels. His neck and shoulders were slashed in a score of places, and his very lips were cut and bleeding, all from those lightning snaps that were beyond his foreseeing and guarding. Time and again, White Fang had attempted to knock Cherokee off his feet, but the difference in their height was too great. Cherokee was too squat, too close to the ground. White Fang tried the trick once too often. The chance came in one of his quick doublings and counter-circlings. He caught Cherokee with head turned away. As he whirled more slowly, his shoulder was exposed. White Fang drove in upon it, but his own shoulder was high above, while he struck with such force that his momentum carried him on across over the other's body. For the first time in his fighting history, men saw White Fang lose his footing. His body turned a half somersault in the air, and he would have landed on his back, had he not twisted cat-like still in the air. In the effort to bring his feet to the earth as it was, he struck heavily on his side. The next instant he was on his feet, but in that instant Cherokee's teeth closed on his throat. It was not a good grip, being too low down toward the chest, but Cherokee held on. White Fang sprang to his feet and tore wildly around, trying to shake off the bulldog's body. It made him frantic, this clinging, dragging weight. It bound his movements, restricted his freedom. It was like the trap, and all his instinct resented it and revolted against it. It was a mad revolt. For several minutes, he was to all instinct intense insane. The basic life that was in him took charge of him. The will to exist of his body surged over him. He was dominated by this mere flesh, flesh love of life. All intelligence was gone. It was as though he had no brain. His reason was unseated by the blind yearning of the flesh to exist and move, at all hazards to move, to continue to move, for movement was the expression of its existence. Round and round he went, whirling and turning and reversing, trying to shake off the 50-pound weight that dragged at his throat. The bulldog did little but kept his grip. Sometimes and rarely he managed to get his feet to the earth, and for a moment to brace himself against White Fang, but the next moment his footing would be lost, and he would be dragging around in the whirl of one of White Fang's mad gyrations. Cherokee identified himself with his instinct. He knew that he was doing the right thing by holding on, and there came to him certain blissful thrills of satisfaction. At such moments he even closed his eyes and allowed his body to be hurled hither and thither, willy-nilly, careless of any hurt that might thereby come to it. That did not count. The grip was the thing, and the grip he kept. White Fang ceased only when he had tired himself out. He could not understand, and he could not he could do nothing, and he could not understand. Never in all his fighting had this thing happened. The dogs he had fought with did not fight that way. With them it was snap and slash and get away, snap and slash and get away. He lay partly on his side, panting for breath. Cherokee, still holding his grip, urged against him, trying to get him over entirely on his side. White Fang resisted, and he could feel the jaws shifting their grip, slightly relaxing and coming together again in a chewing movement. Each shift brought the grip closer into his throat. The bulldog's method was to hold what he had, and when opportunity favored, to work in for more opportunity favored. When White Fang remained quiet, when White Fang struggled, Cherokee was content merely to hold on. The bulging back of Cherokee's neck was the only portion of his body that White Fang's teeth could reach. He got hold toward the base, where the neck comes out from the shoulders, but he did not know the chewing method of fighting, nor were his jaws adapted to it. He spasmodically ripped and tore with his fangs for a space. Then a change in their position diverted him. The bulldog had managed to roll him over on his back, and still hanging on to his throat, was on top of him. Like a cat, White Fang bowed his hindquarters in, and with the feet digging his enemy's abdomen above him, he began to claw with long tearing strokes. Cherokee might well have been disemboweled, had he not quickly pivoted on his grip and got his body off to White Fang's and at right angles to it. There was no escaping that grip. It was like fate itself, and as inexorable. Slowly it shifted up along the jugular. All that saved White Fang from death was the loose skin on his neck, the loose skin of his neck, and the thick fur that covered it. This served to form a large roll in Cherokee's mouth, the fur of which well nigh defied his teeth, but bit by bit, whenever the chance offered, he was getting more of the loose skin and fur in his mouth. The result was that he was slowly throttling White Fang, the latter's breath and drawn with greater and greater difficulty as the moments went by. It began to look as though the battle were over. The backers of Cherokee waxed jubilant and offered ridiculous odds. White Fang's backers were correspondingly depressed, and refused bets of 10 to 1 and 20 to 1, though one man was rash enough to close a wager of 50 to 1. This man was Beauty Smith. He took a step into the ring and pointed his finger at White Fang. Then he began to laugh derivatively and scornfully. This produced the desired effect. White Fang went wild with rage. He called up his reserves of strength and gained his feet. As he struggled around the ring, the 50 pounds of his foe ever dragging on his throat, his anger passed on into panic. The basic life of him dominated him again, and his intelligence fled before the will of his flesh to live. Round and back again, stumbling and falling and rising, even uprearing at times on his hind legs and lifting his foe clear of the earth, he struggled vainly to shake off the clinging death. At first he fell, toppling backwards, exhausted, and the bulldog promptly shifted his grip, getting in closer, mingling more and more of the fur-folded flesh, throttling White Fang more severely than ever. Shouts of applause went up from the victor, and there many cries of "Cherokee, Cherokee" to this Cherokee responded by vigorous wagging of the stump of his tail, but the clamor of approval did not distract him. There was no sympathetic relation between his tail and his massive jaws. The one might wag, but the others held their terrible grip on White Fang's throat. It was at this time that a diversion came to the spectators. There was a jingle of bells. Dog mushers' cries were heard. Everybody save Beauty Smith looked apprehensively, the fear of the police strong upon them, but they saw up the trail and not down. Two men running with sled and dogs. They were evidently coming down the creek from some prospecting trip. At sight of the crowd, they stopped their dogs and came over and joined it, curious to see the cause of the excitement. The dog musher wore a mustache, but the other, taller and younger man, was smooth-shaven, his skin rosy from the pounding of his blood and the running in the frosty air. White Fang had practically ceased struggling. Now and again he resisted spasmodically, and to no purpose he could get little air, and that little grew less and less under the merciless grip that ever tightened in spite of his armor of fur. The great vein of his throat would have long since been torn open, had not the first grip of the bulldog been so low down as to be practically on his chest. It had taken Cherokee a long time to shift that grip upward, and this had also tended further to clog his straws with fur and skin fold. In the meantime, the abysmal brute in Beauty Smith had been rising up into his brain, and mastering the small bit of sanity that he possessed at best. When he saw White Fang's eyes begin to glaze, he knew beyond a doubt that the fight was lost. Then he broke loose. He sprang upon White Fang and began savagely to kick him. There were hisses from the crowd and cries of protest, but that was all. While this went on and Beauty Smith continued to kick White Fang, there was a commotion in the crowd. The tall young newcomer was forcing his way through, shouldering men right and left without ceremony or gentleness. When he broke through into the ring, Beauty Smith was just in the act of delivering another kick. All his weight was on one foot, and he was in a state of unstable equilibrium. At that moment, the newcomer's fist landed a smashing blow full in his face. Beauty Smith's remaining leg left the ground, and his whole body seemed to lift into the air, and he turned over backward and struck the snow. The newcomer turned upon the crowd. "You cowards," he cried, "you beast." He was in a rage himself. a sane rage. His grew his gray eyes seemed metallic and steel-like as they flashed upon the crowd. Beauty Smith regained his feet and came toward him. Sniffling and cowardly, the newcomer did not understand. He did not know how abject a coward the other was, and thought he was coming back intent on fighting. So with a "you beast," he smashed Beauty Smith over backward with a second blow in the face. Beauty Smith decided that the snow was the safest place for him, and lay where he had fallen, making no effort to get up. "Come on, Matt, lend a hand," the newcomer called to the dog musher, who had followed him into the ring. Both men bent over the dogs. Matt had took hold of White Fang, ready to pull when Cherokee's jaws should be loosened. This the younger man endeavored to accomplish by clutching the bulldog's jaws in his hands and trying to spread them. It was a vain undertaking, but he pulled and tugged and wrenched. He kept exclaiming with every expulsion of breath, "Beast." The crowd began to grow unruly, and some of the men were protesting against the spoiling of the sport, but they were silenced when the newcomer lifted his head from his work for a moment and glared at them. "You damn beast! You damn beast!" He finally exploded and went back to his task. "It's no use, Mr. Scott. You can't break them apart that way," Matt said at last. The pair paused and surveyed the locked jaws. "Ain't bleeding much," Matt announced. "Ain't got all the way in yet, but he's liable to any moment," Scott answered. "There, did you see that? He shifted his grip in a bit." The younger man's excitement and apprehension for White Fang was growing. He struck Cherokee about the head savagely again and again, but that did not loosen the jaws. Cherokee wagged the stump of his tail in advertisement that he understood the meaning of the blows, but that he knew he was himself in the right and only doing his duty by keeping his grip. "Won't some of you help?" Scott cried desperately at the crowd, but no help was offered. Instead, the crowd began sarcastically to cheer him on and showered him with gratuitous advice. "You'll have to get a pry," Matt counseled. The other reached into the holster at his hip, drew his revolver, and tried to thrust its muzzle between the bulldog's jaws. He shoved and shoved hard, to the grating of the steel against the locked teeth could be distinctly heard. Both men were on their knees. Bending over the dogs, Tim Keenan strode into the ring. He paused beside Scott and touched him on the shoulder, saying ominously, "Don't break them teeth, stranger." "Then I'll break his neck," Scott retorted, continuing his shoving and wedging with the revolver muzzle. "I said don't break them teeth," the faro dealer repeated more ominously than before. But if it was bluff he intended, it did not work. Scott never desisted from his effort, though he looked up coolly and asked, "Your dog?" The faro dealer grunted. "Then get in here and break this grip." "Well, stranger," the other drawled irritatingly, "I don't mind telling you that's something I ain't worked out for myself. I don't know how to turn the trick." "Then get out of the way," was the reply, and don't bother me. I'm busy." Tim Keenan continued standing over him, but Scott took no further notice of his presence. He had managed to get the muzzle in between the jaws on one side and was trying to get it out between the jaws on the other side. This accomplished, he pried gently and carefully, loosening the jaws a bit at a time, while Matt a bit at a time extricated White Fang's mangled neck. Stand by to receive your dog, was Scott's peremptory order to Cherokee's owner. The faro dealer stooped down obediently and got a firm hold on Cherokee. Now, Scott warned, giving the final pry. The dogs were drawn apart, the bulldog struggling vigorously. Take him away, Scott commanded, and Tim Keenan dragged Cherokee back into the crowd. White Fang made several ineffectual efforts to get up. Once he gained his feet, but his legs were too weak to sustain him, and he slowly wilted and sank back into the snow. His eyes were half closed, and the surface of them was glassy. And though and through them the tongue protruded, dragged and limp to all appearances, he looked like a dog that had been strangled to death. Matt examined him. Just about all in, he announced. But he's breathing all right. Beauty Smith had regained his feet and come over to look at White Fang. Matt, how much is a good sled dog worth? Scott asked. The dog musher still on his knees and stooped over White Fang, calculated for a moment. $300, he answered. And how much for one that's all chewed up like this one? Scott asked, nudging White Fang with, one moment, be right back. Gotta answer something at the door. Okay, I'm back. Um, Sorry about that. I had a delivery. His foot. Let me. And how much for one that's all chewed up like this one? Scott asked, nudging White Fang with his foot. Half of that, was the dog musher's judgment. Scott turned upon Beauty Smith. Did you hear, Mr. Beast? I'm going to take your I'm going to take your dog from you, and I'm going to give you 150 for him. He opened his pocketbook and counted out the bills. Beauty Smith put his hands behind his back, refusing to touch the proffered money. I I ain't a salad, he said. Oh, yes, you are, the other assured him, because I'm buying. Here's your money. The dog's mine. Beauty Smith, his hands still behind him, began to back away. Scott sprang towards him, drawing his fist back to strike. Beauty Smith cowered down in anticipation of the blow. I've got my rights, he whispered. You forfeited your rights to own that dog, was the rejoinder. Are you going to take the money, or do I have to hit you again? All right, Beauty Smith spoke up with the electricity of fear. But I take the money under protest. He added, the dog's a mint. I ain't going to be robbed. Man's got his rights. Correct, Scott answered, passing the money over to him. A man's got his rights, but you're not a man. You're a beast. Wait till I get back to Dawson, Beauty Smith threatened. I'll have the law on you. If you open your mouth when you get back to Dawson, I'll have you run out of town. Understood? Beauty Smith replied with a grunt. Understand? The other thundered with abrupt fierceness. Yes, Beauty Smith grunted, shrinking away. Yes, what? Yes, sir, Beauty Smith snarled. Look out, he'll bite, someone shouted, and a guffaw of laughter went up. Scott turned his back on him and returned to help the dog musher, who was working over White Fang. Some of the men were already departing. Others stood in groups, looking on and talking. Tim Keenan joined one of the groups. Who's that mug? He asked. Weedon Scott. Someone answered. Someone answered. And who in the hell is Weedon Scott? The Pharaoh dealer demanded. Oh, one of them crackerjack mining experts. He's in with all the big bugs. If you want to keep out of trouble, you will steer clear of him. That's my talk. He's all hungry with the officials. The gold commissioner's a special pal of his. I thought he might be somebody, was the Pharaoh dealer's comment. That's why I kept my hands off him at the start. Chapter break. And again, we're going till 100 and 1010. 1100. Chapter 5 The Indomitable. It's hopeless, Weedon Scott confessed. He sat on the step of his cabin and stared at the dog musher, who responded with a shrug that was equally hopeless. Together they looked at White Fang at the end of his stretching chain, bristling, snarling, ferocious, straining to get at the sled dogs, having received sundry lessons from Matt. Said lessons were imparted by means of a club. The sled dogs who learned to leave White Fang alone. And even then they were lying down at a distance, apparently oblivious to his existence. It's a wolf. There's no taming it, Weedon Scott answered. Oh, I don't know about that, Matt objected. Might be a lot of dog in him, for all you can tell, but there's one thing I know sure, and that's no getting away from him. The dog musher paused and nodded his head confidently at Moose Hide Mountain. Well, don't be a miser with what you know, Scott said sharply, after waiting a suitable length of time. Spit it out. What is it? The dog musher indicated White Fang with a backward thrust of his thumb. Wolf or dog, it's all the same. He's been tamed already. No, I tell you yes, and broke to harness. Look close there. Do you see them marks across the chest? You're right, Matt. He was he was a sled dog before Beauty Smith got a hold of him. And there's not much reason against his being a sled dog again. What do you think? Scott questioned eagerly. Then the hope died down as he added, shaking his head. We've had him 2 weeks now, and if anything is ever wilder than ever at the present moment, give him a chance, Matt counseled. Turn him loose for a spell. The other looked at him incredulously. Yes, Matt went on. I know you've tried to, but you didn't take a club. You didn't. You try it then. The dog musher secured a club and went over to the chained animal. White Fang watched the club after the manner of a caged lion watching the whip of its trainer. See him keep his eyes on that club? Matt said. That's a good sign he's no fool. Don't test tackle me so long as I got that club handy. He's not clean crazy, sure. As the man's hand approached his neck, White Fang bristled and snarled, and crouched down. But while he eyed the approaching hand, he at the same time contrived to keep track of the club in the other hand. Suspended threateningly above him, Matt unanswered unsnapped the chain from the collar and stepped back. White Fang could scarcely realize that he was free. Many months had gone by since he passed into the possession of Beauty Smith, and in all that period he had never known a moment of freedom, except at the times he had been loosed to fight with other dogs. Immediately after such fights he had always been imprisoned again. He did not know what to make of it. Perhaps some new devilry of the gods was about to be perpetrated on him. He walked slowly and cautiously, prepared to be assailed at any moment. He did not know what to do. It was all so unprecedented. He took the precaution to sheer off from the two watching gods, and watched carefully to the corner of the cabin. Nothing happened. He was plainly perplexed, and he came back again, pausing a dozen feet away, and regarded the two men intently. Won't he run away? His new owner asked. Matt shrugged his shoulders. Gotta take a gamble. Only way to find out is to find out. Poor devil, Scott murmured pityingly. What he needs is some show of human kindness, he added, turning and going into the cabin. He came out with a piece of meat, which he tossed to White Fang. He sprang away from it, and from a distance studied it suspiciously. Hi, you! Major! Matt shouted warningly, but too late. Major had made a spring for the meat. At the instant his jaws closed on it, White Fang struck him. He was overthrown. Matt rushed in, but quickly then he was White Fang. Major staggered to his feet, but the blood spouting from his throat reddened the snow in a widening path. It's too bad, but it served him right, Scott said hastily. But Matt's foot had already started on its way to kick White Fang. There was a leap, a flash of teeth, a sharp exclamation. White Fang, snarling fiercely, scrambled backwards for several yards, while Matt stooped and investigated his leg. You got me all right, he announced, pointing to the torn trousers and underclothes and the growing stain of red. I told you it was hopeless, Matt, Scott said in a discouraged voice. I've thought about it off and on, while not wanting to think of it, but we've come to I've thought about it off and on, while not wanting to think about it, but we've come to it now. It's the only thing to do. As he talked with reluctant movements, he drew his revolver through, opened the cylinder, and assured himself of its contents. Look here, Mr. Scott, Matt objected. That dog's been through hell. You can't expect him to come out white and shine an angel. Give him time. Look at Major, the other rejoined. The dogmaster surveyed the stricken dog. He had sunk down on the snow, in the circle of his blood, and was plainly in the last gasp. Serve him right, you said so yourself, Mr. Scott. He tried to take White Fang's meat, and he's deado. That was to be expected. I wouldn't give two whoops in hell for a dog that wouldn't fight for his own meat. But look at yourself, Matt. It's all it's all right about the dogs, but we must draw the line somewhere. Serve me right, Matt argued stubbornly. What did I want to kick him for? You said yourself that he'd done right. Then I had no right to kick him. It'd be mercy to it'd be mercy to kill him, Scott insisted. He's untamable. Now look here, Mr. Scott. Give the poor devil a fighting chance. He ain't had no chance yet. He's just come through hell, and this is the first time he's been loose. Give him a fair chance, and if he don't deliver the goods, well, I'll kill him myself. There. God knows I don't want to kill him or have him killed, Scott answered, putting away the revolver. We'll let him run loose and see what kindness can do for him. And here's a try for it. He walked over to White Fang and began talking to him gently and soothingly. Better have a club handy, Matt warned. Scott shook his head and went on trying to win White Fang's confidence. White Fang was suspicious. Something was impending. He had killed this god's dog, bitten his companion god, and what else was to be expected than some terrible punishment? But in the face of it, he was indomitable. He bristled and showed his teeth, his eyes vigilant, his whole body wary and prepared for anything. The god had no club, so he suffered him. To approach quite near, the god's hand had come out and was descending upon his head. White Fang shrank together and grew tense as he crouched under it. Here was danger, some treachery or something. He knew the hands of the gods, their proved mastery, their cunning to hurt. Besides, there was his old antipathy to being touched. He snarled more menacingly, crouched still lower, and still the hand descended. He did not want to bite the hand, and he endured the peril of it until his instinct surged up in him, mastering him with its insatiable yearning for life. Weedon Scott had believed that he was quick enough to avoid any snap or slash, but he had yet to learn the remarkable quickness of White Fang, who struck with the certainty and swiftness of a coiled snake. Scott cried out sharply with surprise, catching his torn hand and holding it tightly in his other hand. Matt uttered a great oath and sprang to his side. White Fang crouched down and backed away, bristling, showing his fangs, his eyes malignant with menace. Now he could expect a beating as fearful as any he had received from Beauty Smith. Here, what are you doing? Scott cried suddenly. Matt had dashed into the cabin and come out with a rifle. Nothing. he said slowly with a careless calmness that was assumed. Only going to make that only going to make that only going to keep that promise I made. I reckon it's up to me to kill him as I said I'd do. No, you don't. Yes, I do. Watch me. As Matt had pleaded for White Fang when he had been bitten, it was now Whedon Scott's turn to plead. You said to give him a chance. We'll give it to him. We've only just started, and we can't quit at the beginning. It served me right this time, and look at him. White Fang near the corner of the cabin, and 40 feet away, was snarling with blood-curdling viciousness. Not at Scott, but at the dog musher. Well, I'll be everlastingly gosh swag was the dog musher's expression of astonishment, and we'll stop there. Plan is that next time we'll go ahead and I believe it's next time. Next time we'll go ahead and finish. Next time I'm planning on finishing this book. So for right now, though, let's go ahead and do the outros. Thank you everyone for watching. Have a great night. Stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you all on the next stream, where it'll be tomorrow at 2 o'clock EST is the plan, which I'll be playing Kingdom Hearts 3. But for right now, let's go ahead and find someone to raid off to. Give me a moment. So here's the thing. Again, I wouldn't usually do this. I try to raid to the lower ends of viewers, to those who have too many viewers at the present. But I don't know. I just feel like, kind of for the heck of it, kind of because she's really nice, I kind of want to go ahead and just keep raiding off to Haruka. She acknowledged me on Monday. Yesterday, she called me her friend in front of Zen, and I really appreciated that. And I think it'd be a good idea to go ahead and read off to Haruka. Just give me a moment to copy and paste the name and get things ready for the raid. All right, let's go ahead and raid off to Haruka. Caribou is currently playing Pokemon Snap. Please give them love and support, and I'll see you all on tomorrow for Kingdom Hearts 3. That is the plan. Later.